The crown was never just a symbol of power. It was a target, a burden, and sometimes a lie. Behind the velvet gowns and royal portraits lived women who broke rules, broke hearts, and occasionally broke the entire monarchy. Some were queens, some were pawns, all were scandal. They weren't supposed to have desires. They weren't supposed to be remembered. But history couldn't forget them, no matter how hard the palace tried. These are 25 royal women who slept with everyone. Allegedly. Welcome to the side of royalty that doesn't make it into the official portraits. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for more late-night royal chaos, forbidden histories, and scandals the crown would rather keep buried. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you deep into a midnight rabbit hole, or just casually listening to royal drama over breakfast? We won't judge, probably. 1. Caroline of Brunswick. If you were to invent a character to scandalize a monarchy, you couldn't do better than Caroline of Brunswick. She had the timing of a comic, the stubbornness of a mule, the survival instincts of a street fighter, and just enough royal blood to cause permanent damage. But perhaps the most damning thing about Caroline wasn't what she did. It was that she didn't care who was watching. Born in 1768 to the Duke of Brunswick and Princess Augusta of Great Britain, Caroline was a daughter of the House of Hanover and cousin to her future husband George, Prince of Wales. She grew up in a court that encouraged eccentricity but demanded obedience, and she took that contradiction and wore it like perfume. From the start, Caroline's life was an open secret. She was witty, crass, charming, and disinterested in restraint. Her household in Germany was chaotic. The gossip about her flirtations, behavior, and general disregard for propriety crossed borders faster than her dowry. When it came time to find a wife for the Prince of Wales, Caroline was politically useful, Protestant, and, on paper, acceptable. That was enough for the men signing the papers. It was not, however, enough for George. When Caroline arrived in England in 1795, George took one look at her and allegedly demanded brandy. The wedding went ahead because this was monarchy and not reality television, but the tone was set. George detested her from day one. She found him grotesque, overdressed, and already entangled in an ongoing affair with Frances Villiers, Lady Jersey, who, insult to injury, was appointed as one of Caroline's ladies-in-waiting. Their marriage lasted long enough to produce one child, Princess Charlotte, and then collapsed spectacularly. George moved out. Caroline moved on, emotionally, geographically, and, according to public opinion, perhaps romantically. The list of men who were allegedly too close to Caroline would have given a lesser woman a complex. There was George Canning, future Prime Minister, whose association with her was enough to fuel speculation. Then there was Admiral Sidney Smith, whose gallant manners and enthusiastic praise of her character raised more than eyebrows. But most notorious of all was Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian courier who rose through the ranks of her household and, depending on who you believe, into her bedroom. Caroline had taken up residence abroad by then, traveling across Europe in a kind of royal exile of her own making. While George lived in England and surrounded himself with scandals of his own, Caroline gallivanted through Italy, attending parties, writing letters, entertaining diplomats, and spending an awful lot of time with Pergami. He was given titles, access, and rooms near her own. The rumors practically wrote themselves. By the time George ascended to the throne in 1820, he was determined to be rid of her. Officially, publicly, permanently. What followed was the trial of Queen Caroline, a parliamentary proceeding to dissolve the marriage on the grounds of adultery. It was part courtroom, part circus, and all spectacle. Witnesses were bribed, papers were forged, and servants were paraded to describe alleged indecencies in broken English. The British public, ever drawn to a scandal involving royalty and hypocrisy, took Caroline's side. Riots broke out in her favor. The queen who had been mocked as vulgar became a folk heroine, not because she was innocent, but because she was honest. George was seen as a bloated hypocrite, a man who kept mistresses with state funding but wanted his wife condemned for having companions. Caroline, meanwhile, appeared in court with bravado, humor, and a flair for melodrama. She was refused entrance to George's coronation. She stood at the Abbey gates anyway. The doors were barred. The message was clear. She may have been queen in title, but she would not be queen in ceremony. Caroline died just weeks later, in August 1821, at age 53. Some said she died of grief. Others said she died of illness. Most agreed she died with dignity, or at least defiance. Her funeral procession was met with further riots, and her legacy was cemented not as a moral lesson, but as a symbol of a woman who refused to play along, no matter how many times the palace tried to write her out. Did Caroline of Brunswick sleep with everyone? The evidence is inconclusive. The gossip is overwhelming. But perhaps that's beside the point. Caroline's real scandal wasn't her lovers. It was her audacity to mock power, to live loudly, and to make monarchy look ridiculous. And for a royal family that depends entirely on the illusion of control, that was the most unforgivable crime of all. 2. Catherine Howard. The story of Catherine Howard is less a scandal than a slow-motion execution of innocence, a bright, reckless flicker snuffed out by the cold machinery of the Tudor court. She was Henry VIII's fifth wife, his rose without a thorn, and a teenage girl shoved into a role that had already consumed 4 women before her. Some of them had died. None had escaped. And Catherine, barely out of girlhood, walked straight into the jaws of history with a smile on her face and the wrong names in her past. She was born sometime around 1523. The exact year is uncertain, which says everything about how seriously people took her existence until it became inconvenient. Catherine was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a noble in name but not in fortune, and Joyce Culpeper, whose bloodlines were just royal enough to keep Catherine in the game. After her father's finances collapsed, she was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, an environment that was less a finishing school and more a gossip-fueled sleepaway camp for young aristocrats. It was in this chaotic household that Catherine's so-called scandals began. She shared a room with several other girls, slept behind thin curtains, and was exposed early to flirtations, games, and the affections of men who should have known better. Her first known entanglement was with her music tutor, Henry Mannix, a man she may have shared letters, kisses, and secrets with. Soon after, she became involved with Francis Derham, a secretary in the Duchess's household. Their relationship was more serious, possibly even quasi-marital. They called each other husband and wife, shared gifts, and were likely considered betrothed by the informal standards of the time. None of this mattered, until it did. When Catherine arrived at court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, she was still a teenager with a complicated past and no reason to expect a future. Then Henry VIII noticed her. He was in his late 40s, plagued by ill health and humiliated by his failed fourth marriage. Catherine was young, vivacious, and radiant in a way that made Henry feel like less of a dying man and more of a reborn king. The age gap was staggering. The power gap was worse. But she smiled, and he believed it. Their courtship, if you can call it that, was brief and public. They were married within weeks of Anne of Cleves' annulment in 1540. Catherine was officially queen and unofficially a distraction, a walking, talking promise that Henry could still command youth and beauty. She played the part with charm. She danced, she sang, she wrote affectionate notes. And in the back corridors of court, she was being watched. It wasn't long before the rumors began. Servants whispered about her past with Derham. Others hinted at a new favorite, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber and a man who, like so many courtiers, was just ambitious enough to mistake flirtation for opportunity. Their relationship, whether emotional, physical, or somewhere in between, was carried out with the help of Lady Rochford, Catherine's lady-in-waiting, and Anne Boleyn's infamous sister-in-law. The court, already bloated with suspicion, didn't need much evidence to move. Letters were seized, servants interrogated. Catherine was accused of having had an unchaste life previous to her marriage, and of continuing illicit relations afterward. Derham was arrested. Culpeper was tortured. Both confessed, though exactly what they confessed to remains lost beneath layers of coercion and political necessity. Catherine was imprisoned, questioned, and isolated. Henry, who had once called her his jewel of womanhood, now declared he had been deceived, that she was a notorious strumpet who had corrupted his old age with youthful betrayal. The irony was almost too perfect. A king who had discarded wives for not bearing sons now shocked that a teenager wasn't emotionally monogamous. What Catherine actually did remains impossible to confirm. The relationships with Manox and Derham predated her marriage, but Henry considered them evidence of premeditated deceit. The alleged affair with Culpeper may have been a flirtation inflated into treason, or it may have been real, or coerced, or misunderstood. The truth, as with most Tudor scandals, drowned in the speed of vengeance. She was never given a trial. Her fate was decided by the King's Council. She was stripped of her title, her household disbanded, her family shamed. She was beheaded on February 13, 1542, on the same scaffold where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. She was 19. The legend goes that she asked for the block to be brought to her cell the night before, so she could practice laying her head on it with dignity. It may not be true. It doesn't need to be. The image has stuck, because it captures the horrifying truth of her life, that even in death she was expected to perform. Was Catherine guilty of adultery? Of deceit? Of betrayal? Perhaps. But what's clearer is that she was guilty of being young in a court that demanded experience, and experienced in a world that demanded innocence. She was not a seductress. She was a survivor, until she wasn't. And if Catherine Howard's scandal ended with the silence of execution, the next queens unfolded in whispers, alliances, and a partnership that never had to be consummated to shake the foundations of monarchy. Because while some queens were punished for their lovers, others ruled with them. And history, ever partial, rarely makes the same mistakes twice. If you're still here after 2 royal disasters and a pile of decapitated reputations, you're exactly our kind of audience. Go ahead and subscribe. You clearly have a taste for scandal with a side of history. Also, we're curious. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Are you watching this in the dead of night like a Tudor ghost, or pretending it's background noise during work? Let us know in the comments. We see you. 3. Isabella of France. History remembers Isabella of France by one nickname, the she-wolf of France, which is a bit unfair to wolves. Born a French princess, Isabella was married off to England's Edward II at just 12 years old. It was a textbook political marriage, unions signed in ink, expectations in blood. She crossed the Channel with French jewels in her hair and diplomatic duty in her veins. What she didn't know was that her husband already had a partner, and it wasn't her. Edward II's affections were famously entangled with a man named Piers Gaveston, a charismatic courtier whose influence over the king made the entire nobility grind their teeth into dust. Isabella found herself not only sidelined, but outright humiliated. Gaveston was given titles, lands, and personal gifts that should have belonged to the queen. At Edward's coronation, it was Gaveston, not Isabella, who received the spotlight. Imagine your wedding day being overshadowed by your husband's best friend, who also gets to wear a more impressive outfit. After Gaveston's eventual execution by jealous nobles, an act that Edward never quite forgave, Isabella might have hoped for a more traditional royal marriage. Instead, she got Hugh Despencer the Younger, a new favorite who was somehow even more hated than the last. The Despensers terrorized court life, exiled nobles, and used their proximity to Edward to seize power like kids let loose in a candy shop with diplomatic immunity. Meanwhile, Isabella was sent on a diplomatic mission to France in 1325. But instead of returning like a loyal queen, she decided to rewrite the story. While in Paris, she reconnected with Roger Mortimer, a nobleman who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to France. And here's where the real scandal begins. Mortimer wasn't just a rebel. He was a lightning rod, a disgraced nobleman turned outlaw with charisma to spare and vengeance in his veins. Isabella and Mortimer became allies, then confidants, then, allegedly, lovers. The English court spun with rumors of secret trysts and whispered betrayals. Some claimed she was seduced. Others said she was the one doing the seducing. What's clear is this. She returned to England not with apologies, but with an army. Together, Isabella and Mortimer launched an invasion. Edward II was deposed, publicly, humiliatingly, and later died in captivity under circumstances that remain murky. Theories range from simple neglect to a far more theatrical and disturbing end, though no credible record confirms any version. What matters is that Isabella didn't just topple a king, she ruled in his place. For 4 years, she and Mortimer governed England in the name of her son, Edward III. They held power, patronage, and public favor until they didn't. In 1330, Edward III came of age and staged a coup against his mother's partner. Mortimer was executed, Isabella imprisoned, but spared. She lived the rest of her life in relative comfort, outliving almost everyone who had ever tried to reduce her to scandal. Did Isabella love Mortimer? Possibly. Did she use him? Absolutely. But what's most fascinating isn't whether they shared a bed, it's that they shared power. And for a medieval queen, that was the far more dangerous affair. The she-wolf of France? Maybe. But wolves hunt in packs. Isabella didn't. She fought alone, reigned briefly, and disappeared into a long silence, one that only grows louder with time. And yet, if Isabella's rebellion felt operatic, the next queen's tragedy was a quieter kind. One told in flirtations, jealousy, and a final accusation so theatrical it could have been written for the stage. Or the scaffold. 4. Anne Boleyn. To understand Anne Boleyn, you must first understand the English obsession with blaming women for starting wars, seducing kings, and rearranging the entire theological structure of Europe with nothing but a sideways glance and a low neckline. Anne didn't just cause a scandal. She caused England to break up with the Pope, and then got ghosted by her own husband. Before she was queen, Anne was the intelligent, sharp-tongued daughter of an ambitious courtier, educated in the Netherlands and France, which meant she not only knew how to flirt, she knew how to win. She returned to England already glowing with continental charisma and immediately attracted attention, though not the kind she wanted. Initially, Henry VIII was far more interested in her sister Mary Boleyn, who'd already been his mistress and allegedly a mistress to half the French court. So, no pressure. Anne wasn't just another court beauty. She had opinions. She had agency. She read Tyndale and talked politics. She didn't just play the game, she started flipping the pieces off the board. When Henry approached her, expecting the usual mistress arrangement, Anne said no. Not because she wasn't interested, but because she knew she was playing a longer game. The throne. Henry, unaccustomed to resistance, became obsessed. Over the course of 6 years, he tried to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, upend Catholic orthodoxy, and rebrand himself as supreme head of the Church of England, all because Anne refused to sleep with him until she wore a crown. For Henry, it was love. For Anne, it was probably more like strategic terror. When she finally did marry him, the honeymoon didn't last. After all that drama, England expected a miracle. Instead, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, a girl. Henry tried to hide his disappointment, but the clock had started ticking. Anne miscarried more than once. Her political enemies multiplied. She went from enchantress to liability at court. And Henry, ever the romantic, began looking elsewhere, most notably toward Jane Seymour, who was quieter, blander, and critically not Anne. But the real unraveling began when the court started whispering that Anne was too familiar with certain courtiers, that she flirted too boldly, that her charm had turned to manipulation. Eventually, charges were concocted. 5 men were arrested, including her brother, George Boleyn, and accused of adultery with the Queen. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses coerced, and the entire trial felt less like justice and more like a stage play written by Henry's conscience. Historians have debated Anne's guilt for centuries. Was she unfaithful? Probably not. Was she reckless? Possibly. Was she doomed from the moment she gave birth to a daughter? Absolutely. The irony, of course, is that the daughter Anne left behind, Elizabeth I, would become one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. But Anne didn't live to see it. Her story ends not with vindication, but with erasure. Her image was removed, her reputation blackened, her very existence transformed into a cautionary tale about ambition and female intellect. Because what Anne Boleyn represented wasn't adultery, it was disruption. She disrupted marriage, religion, power, the idea that a woman could control the narrative. She didn't die for sleeping with the wrong people. She died for saying no, for saying yes on her terms, and for daring to be smarter than the men around her. And speaking of women whose intelligence was a liability, the next royal took scandal to a whole new continent, only to find herself entangled in rumors, rebellion, and a series of unfortunate husbands. Hers is a story of survival, seduction, and strategic silence, none of which saved her. 5. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, is what happens when you're born with too many crowns and not enough luck. She became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old, Queen Consort of France as a teenager, and an exiled widow before she turned 20. Her life was a kaleidoscope of shifting allegiances, royal betrayals, and romantic choices so catastrophic they should be studied in political science classes under the heading, How to Undermine Your Own Throne in 3 Easy Marriages. But first, the context. Mary was a Catholic queen in an increasingly Protestant Britain, a tall, charismatic presence with French elegance and Scottish blood. She returned to Scotland after her first husband, the sickly Francis II of France, died young. She arrived back on native soil with a crown, some fashionable enemies, and one colossal mistake yet to be made. That mistake had a name: Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Her cousin, her second husband, a man so entitled, arrogant, and politically toxic that even the Protestant reformers couldn't decide whether to hate him more for his vanity or his ambition. But he was good-looking and politically convenient. So Mary married him. The honeymoon lasted about 5 minutes. Darnley expected to be made co-sovereign, which Mary refused. In retaliation, he began consorting with enemies, publicly undermining her, and eventually participating in the brutal murder of her secretary, David Rizzio, right in front of her while she was pregnant. Things, somehow, got worse. A year later, Darnley was dead. His house exploded in the middle of the night, and his body was found outside. Strangled, not burned. It was the kind of plot twist that made even 16th-century nobles go, "Hang on a second." Suspicion fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man with military power, questionable morals, and a suspiciously close relationship with Mary. Weeks after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. And not quietly either. The optics were catastrophic. Her husband had just died in a highly theatrical and unsolved murder, and now she was aligning herself with the prime suspect. Scotland rebelled. Mary was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. Bothwell fled and eventually died in a Danish prison. Mary fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, offered a warm welcome, laced with cold suspicion. Mary was, after all, a legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne. Over the next 19 years, she became Elizabeth's royal prisoner, living in castles and manors with just enough luxury to prevent rebellion and just enough surveillance to ensure despair. But scandal doesn't sleep, even under house arrest. During her captivity, Mary was implicated in various plots to assassinate Elizabeth, most notably the Babington plot, a conspiracy involving coded letters, assassination plans, and too much trust in servants. When the letters were intercepted and traced to Mary, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, reluctantly, but decisively. Mary died as she lived, stylishly, dramatically, and surrounded by contradiction. She wore a red petticoat to her execution, the color of martyrdom. She forgave her executioner. Her death was framed as justice, but the echoes sounded more like fear. Was Mary reckless? Undoubtedly. Was she guilty? Debatable. Was she powerful enough to scare another queen into keeping her locked away for 2 decades? Absolutely. But Mary's true legacy isn't in the men she married or the conspiracies she may have joined. It's in the bloodline she passed on. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would become James I of England, uniting the 2 crowns and ushering in a new era of royal politics. Mary lost the battles, but her descendants won the war. And that brings us to a different kind of queen. One who never married, never gave in, and whose lovers, if they existed, became legends in their own right. The next story isn't about scandal denied, but scandal managed. And her greatest affair may have been with power itself. 6. Queen Elizabeth I. They called her the Virgin Queen, which is probably the most aggressive PR campaign in Tudor history. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years, reshaped the monarchy, and danced through a minefield of Catholic plots, marriage proposals, and national paranoia. But for all her political finesse, her love life remains the most persistent mystery, mostly because she never allowed anyone to confirm or deny anything. That, of course, only made the whispers louder. From the beginning, Elizabeth's image was a contradiction. She was both regal and flirtatious, devout and theatrical, untouchable yet surrounded by favorites. She claimed chastity as a virtue, but used romantic ambiguity like a political weapon. She never married, which was a revolutionary act in a time when queens were expected to secure their power through childbirth, not charisma. In a court full of schemers and courtiers, Elizabeth weaponized her own desirability, using it not to fulfill expectations, but to frustrate them. And standing at the heart of that weaponized image was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Dudley had known Elizabeth since childhood. When she became queen, he became her master of the horse, a title that, in the Tudor court, meant more than just managing the royal stables. He was constantly by her side. She gave him rooms near her own. They danced together, laughed together, whispered in corners. And then, of course, the gossip began. Their relationship was viewed with suspicion from the start, not just because of the chemistry, but because Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived far from court and was considered an obstacle. In 1560, she was found dead at the foot of a staircase, her neck broken. The coroner ruled it an accident. The public smelled conspiracy. Elizabeth never recovered politically from that moment. Marrying Dudley after Amy's death would have been a scandal too far. The optics were impossible. Even if she had nothing to do with it, the court of public opinion had made up its mind. So she didn't marry him. She didn't marry anyone. But she kept Dudley close, very close. until his death in 1588. Other names danced through the margins of her life. The dashing Sir Walter Raleigh, who charmed her with poetry before annoying her with ambition. The Earl of Essex, a volatile favorite whose final rebellion cost him his head, but not his place in Elizabeth's private grief. Even foreign suitors, princes, archdukes, kings, were encouraged and then discarded, pawns in her long political game. So, did Elizabeth have lovers? No one knows. And that's the point. She cultivated the mystery as carefully as her image. To be loved, not possessed. To be courted, but never captured. Her virginity wasn't about purity. It was about power. She turned herself into a symbol, untouchable and immortal. Less a queen and more a living myth. But that myth came at a cost. She died alone, surrounded not by children or family, but by anxious courtiers and fading portraits. In the end, she had loved her country more than any man. Or perhaps she simply loved what power made possible. But beneath the powdered wigs and the grand oratory was a woman who had learned, early and brutally, that affection could be a liability. Her private life remains an archive of silences, filled with glances, letters, and half-truths. And perhaps that's why her story endures, not because we know what happened, but because we never will. And while Elizabeth turned romance into politics, the next royal turned politics into a royal disaster, complete with paparazzi, press scandals, and a lover 17 years her junior. This story doesn't unfold in candlelight, but in flashbulbs. And it's a reminder that even in the 20th century, the palace walls were never thick enough to muffle a broken heart. 7. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret was the royal family's original wildfire, brilliant, unpredictable, and absolutely uninterested in doing what she was told. As the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, Margaret was born into privilege but not power. A perpetual second, tasked with being dazzling but not dangerous. Where Elizabeth was dutiful, Margaret was defiant. Where Elizabeth turned herself into a stoic symbol of national continuity, Margaret was a walking contradiction. Aristocratic and rebellious, glamorous and lonely, sharp-witted and deeply wounded. From a young age, she was caught between the expectations of monarchy and the chaos of real emotion. Nowhere was that more apparent than in her relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero, commoner, and divorcee. Their romance was explosive, not because it was illicit, but because it was impossible. The Church of England, of which her sister was the supreme governor, frowned upon remarriage after divorce. And so, at age 25, Margaret was forced to choose love or duty. She chose duty, publicly at least. In 1955, she issued a formal statement ending the engagement, cloaking heartbreak in royal language. It was a national drama disguised as etiquette, and it marked a turning point. After that, Margaret leaned into the role she had been unofficially assigned, the tragic royal beauty. She smoked, drank, danced until dawn, and kept company with artists, actors, and aristocrats who didn't know when to stop talking. In 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer with a bohemian streak and a closet full of secrets. Their marriage was a heady mix of art, infidelity, and mutual resentment. While the tabloids feasted on their glamorous appearances, the reality was far messier. Affairs were not just whispered about, they were expected. Margaret's own turn toward scandal came with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior. Their affair began in the mid-1970s and quickly became a tabloid feeding frenzy. Photographers captured them in swimsuits on Caribbean beaches, laughing in the sun while the British press clutched its pearls. Roddy wasn't a peer or a politician. He was young, attractive, and almost aggressively ordinary, which made him irresistible to Margaret and intolerable to her critics. Their relationship lasted nearly a decade, and ended with more of a sigh than a scandal. But its existence had already done the damage. Margaret's marriage collapsed. The royal family, increasingly obsessed with preserving its fragile image, distanced itself. But Margaret, ever the contrarian, didn't apologize. She once said, "I have always had a dread of being labeled a royal parasite," and lived accordingly, spending her life proving she could be as flawed, passionate, and impulsive as any commoner. If her lovers shocked people, it was only because they expected her to be less human than she was. Was she punished for it? Yes, in quiet ways. She was slowly edged out of the public eye, her reputation sanded down into caricature. But behind the headlines and the scandals was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and who she was disappointing by doing it. Princess Margaret didn't sleep with everyone. She just didn't sleepwalk through life. And if Margaret scandalized the monarchy with her romantic choices, the next woman made scandal part of her job description. A duchess, a mistress, and an accused sorceress. Her enemies didn't just question her virtue, they questioned her very soul. 8. Eleanor Cobham. If Eleanor Cobham had been born in a different century, she might have made a fine political strategist, a literary muse, or the protagonist in a Shakespearean tragedy. Wait, actually, she was. Kind of. As Duchess of Gloucester and wife to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest son of King Henry IV, and heir presumptive to the English throne for a time, Eleanor's life was steeped in ambition, drama, and eventually, accusation. But before she became the unfortunate star of England's favorite witchcraft scandal, she was something far more dangerous. Clever, beautiful, and socially mobile. She started as a lady-in-waiting to Jacqueline of Hainaut, Humphrey's first wife. Then, somewhat inconveniently, she became Humphrey's mistress. After Jacqueline was cast aside through a rather legally suspect annulment, Eleanor married Humphrey, ascending from lady-in-waiting to duchess. Not bad, considering the strict social elevators of 15th century England usually stopped at mistress and refused to go higher. Her rise was accompanied by scandalous murmurs from the court. She was ambitious, outspoken, and conspicuously present in her husband's political life. And Humphrey was no backbencher. As Lord Protector during the minority of Henry VI, he had significant influence, though not as much as he wanted. The power struggle between Humphrey and other nobles was vicious, public, and filled with equal parts entitlement and paranoia. Eleanor, ever visible, became a target. In 1441, the accusations began. Allegedly, she had consulted astrologers and necromancers to predict the king's death, a suspiciously specific form of treason. Her enemies claimed she was trying to ensure her husband's rise to the throne by supernatural means. It was political theater disguised as moral outrage, because when you can't discredit a duke directly, you go for his wife. The trial was a mix of spectacle and ritual humiliation. Eleanor's associates, the astrologers and so-called magicians, were tried and sentenced, and several were executed. Eleanor herself was spared execution but condemned to a different kind of death, public penance and lifelong imprisonment. She was paraded through the streets of London on 3 separate occasions, forced to walk barefoot and in black, reciting prayers for the sin of dabbling in forbidden knowledge. For a woman of her rank, it was less about shame and more about symbolic demolition. She was erased without being killed, a punishment designed to stain her name while keeping the court technically moral. She spent the rest of her life imprisoned in various castles, mostly forgotten, largely silenced. Her husband, stripped of influence, would die mysteriously a few years later, just before a major political trial that might have further embarrassed the crown. Some say natural causes. Others say he was helped along. Was Eleanor actually guilty of trying to kill the king? Almost certainly not. Was she guilty of being dangerously close to power and refusing to stay in her assigned place? Absolutely. Her crime wasn't treason or sorcery. It was ambition, dressed in silk and whispered through astrologers' charts. Her fall marked a warning shot to women at court. Rise too fast, speak too loudly, and someone will eventually accuse you of dark magic, especially if your husband is too close to the throne. Eleanor's story ends not with fire or sword, but with slow erasure. She died in obscurity, her name kept alive only in court records and Gothic retellings. But what remains, even centuries later, is the uneasy feeling that her real sin was never what she did. It was who she became. And speaking of women who became infamous not for what they did, but who they did it with, the next royal didn't even have to marry into scandal. She was Scandal, sipping tea in a corset while managing her lovers like a Regency-era dating app. History may call her a countess, but society knew better. She was the Prince of Wales's mistress, and far from his only one. 9. Lady Jersey, Frances Villiers. If the British monarchy had a casting department, Lady Jersey would have been their go-to femme fatale. Sharp-tongued, impeccably dressed, and just scandalous enough to keep court life interesting. Frances Villiers, Countess of Jersey, was born into aristocracy, but ascended into notoriety. She didn't have to claw her way into court. She waltzed in, well-married, well-connected, and with a talent for persuasion. By the time George, Prince of Wales, the future George IV, was looking for distractions from his towering debts and collapsing respectability, Lady Jersey was already a fixture in high society. Their affair was not a hidden one. She was his mistress in the most old-fashioned, contractual sense of the term, publicly acknowledged, politically useful, and deeply resented by everyone who had to pretend this wasn't all horribly awkward, including George's legal wife, Caroline of Brunswick. In fact, it was Lady Jersey who helped orchestrate George's reluctant marriage to Caroline, a union that would become one of the most disastrous royal marriages in British history. The irony? Frances was still very much the prince's mistress at the time, and Caroline knew it. From the moment Caroline arrived in England, Lady Jersey made herself her unofficial tormentor-in-chief. She mocked her, spied on her, and made sure she was isolated at court. It was mean girl politics with state implications. But Lady Jersey wasn't just a one-scandal pony. She had affairs with other high-ranking aristocrats, maneuvered through social circles with surgical precision, and somehow managed to keep her position at court long after most royal mistresses were quietly retired. What made her exceptional wasn't that she had power, it was that she used it unapologetically. She was once described as irresistibly charming and completely untrustworthy, which, to be fair, is probably how half the aristocracy hoped to be remembered. She didn't care much for public opinion. She cared about influence, and unlike many women of her era, she wasn't afraid to wield it, even if it came at the expense of reputation. Lady Jersey's hold over George weakened eventually, as all royal affairs do, but she never entirely vanished from his orbit. Her name became synonymous with court intrigue, and her role in the Caroline debacle ensured she'd be remembered not just as a mistress, but as a political player. A woman whose bedroom access translated into real, tangible influence. Of course, history rarely treats royal mistresses with nuance. They're either romanticized or vilified, never both. Lady Jersey was neither victim nor villain. She was a strategist who played the game better than most men around her. She loved power, and she found the shortest path to it, through the prince. And if her scandal was about proximity to power, the next woman's was about staying there too long. She wasn't a royal either, but she was more than just a mistress. She was a legacy. Her descendants would marry into royalty. Her affairs would become myth, and the king she loved would one day be remembered as the one who needed her more than he needed his crown. 10. Alice Keppel. Every monarchy has that one woman who doesn't belong on the throne but somehow rules anyway. For the British royal family in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that woman was Alice Keppel. She wasn't born into scandal. She married into it. Her husband, the Honorable George Keppel, was a gentleman in title and temperament, which is to say, he politely turned a blind eye when Alice began her most famous relationship, her long-standing affair with Edward VII, then still the Prince of Wales. George reportedly took the news with dignified resignation, as if someone had told him the weather would be disappointing that day. Edward VII was no stranger to mistresses. He collected them the way other men collected cigars, in plush boxes with exotic labels and without much thought for expiration dates. But Alice was different. Elegant, sharp, politically aware, and charming without trying too hard, she became not just a mistress, but a trusted confidant. And that's what made her dangerous. She wasn't just sleeping with the future king, she was advising him. By the time Edward ascended to the throne in 1901, Alice had cemented her position as his unofficial partner in everything except paperwork. She attended court functions, managed social alliances, and helped smooth over royal tempers when the king had one of his famous sulks. She was in many ways more useful than half the cabinet. And yet, officially, she had no title, no position. She operated in the liminal space between scandal and statecraft, a social ghost with a real-world impact. Everyone knew who she was. No one dared challenge her. Unlike some royal mistresses of the past, dramatic, demanding, or tragically disposable, Alice was pragmatic. She understood the rules of the game and played it with exquisite precision. She didn't seek to embarrass the queen or make public scenes. She maintained the fiction of discretion, which was really all anyone expected. Queen Alexandra, Edward's long-suffering wife, tolerated her with icy civility. After all, Alice was only one in a long line of distractions. But even so, her presence rankled. Not because she was there, but because she lasted. Through affairs, scandals, and illnesses, Alice remained. She was, for over a decade, the most stable relationship in Edward VII's adult life. When the king lay dying in 1910, Alice was reportedly sent for. But Queen Alexandra had finally had enough. She forbade Alice from entering the room. Whether or not Alice made it in is still debated by biographers. But the symbolism of that moment is clear. The king was fading, and the court was quietly rewriting the guest list. After Edward's death, Alice retired from the royal scene with grace and remarkable financial security. She faded from public life, but not from historical memory. And, as fate would have it, her great-granddaughter, Camilla Parker Bowles, would go on to reprise the role of royal mistress turned accepted partner, only with considerably more press coverage. Alice Keppel represents a turning point in royal scandal, a shift from torchlit gossip to daylight diplomacy. Her affair with Edward wasn't just a romance, it was a strategy, a quiet partnership between a king in need of emotional intelligence and a woman who knew exactly how to be indispensable without being official. And if Alice was the mistress who whispered in the ear of a king, the next woman was the queen who whispered to ghosts, secrets, and history itself. Her scandal wasn't an affair exactly, but a rumor that refused to die, a suggestion that beneath the mourning veil there might have been something more than grief. 11. Catherine de' Medici. Now, strictly speaking, Catherine de' Medici was not a British royal. She was a French queen, but her influence seeped into the politics of England through dynastic marriages, shifting alliances, and a shared European habit of treating women with power as either witches or temptresses, usually both. And in Catherine's case, there were enough lovers, legends, and political maneuverings to warrant a chapter in any royal scandal anthology. Born into the Medici family, a clan of bankers, popes, and occasional poisoners, Catherine was married off to the future King Henry II of France. But even before the wedding linens were embroidered, she faced her first scandal. Her husband's heart already belonged to another woman, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine was queen in title, but Diane controlled the man. Still, Catherine waited, observed, learned. She had children, lots of them, and when Henry II died, she began her real career, ruling through her sons, manipulating alliances, and quietly consolidating power behind velvet curtains. She became the ultimate courtly puppeteer, a role that came with many accusations. Was she involved in arranging politically convenient marriages? Absolutely. Did she dabble in dark arts, as her enemies claimed? Probably not, but the rumors were too juicy to ignore. She was accused of keeping a cabinet of poisons, employing astrologers, and hosting court experiments that blurred the line between science and scandal. Her court, people whispered, was full of hidden doors and dangerous liaisons. As for lovers, the evidence is less definitive. Catherine was rumored to have formed close attachments with certain male courtiers and military commanders, but nothing ever rose to the level of confirmed affairs. Still, her emotional entanglements often overlapped with her political strategies. And in a world where influence was often traded in whispers and warm glances, that alone was enough to spark suspicion. More importantly, she was the mother-in-law of Mary, Queen of Scots. The two women shared not just family ties but reputations. Both were vilified for their supposed romantic improprieties and blamed for the actions of men. The Protestant pamphleteers in England seized on Catherine's image as the Catholic she-devil, painting her as a seductress, a puppet master, and an icon of corruption. The fact that she was effective only made the stories more intense. Catherine's scandal lies not in what she did behind closed doors, but in how easily people believed she did it. She was too clever, too composed, and too durable for comfort. So naturally, they assumed she was hiding something. By the end of her life, Catherine had survived wars, assassinations, betrayals, and the collapse of almost every alliance she'd helped build. She died not in disgrace, but in exhaustion, outlived by few, mourned by fewer. But her legacy endured, particularly in the way female rulers would be treated for centuries, praised for their intelligence but punished for their autonomy. And if Catherine de' Medici brought whispers of witchcraft and foreign danger into England's royal imagination, the next woman on our list brought scandal straight from within. A British-born queen who married a foreign king, fell for her physician, and watched her world unravel in a very public and deeply personal collapse. 12. Caroline Matilda of Great Britain. Caroline Matilda was born into a royal family that treated marriages like diplomatic invoices, calculated, cold, and signed in ink rather than affection. She was the youngest child of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and the sister of the future King George III. So naturally, she was shipped off to Denmark at age 15 to marry her cousin, King Christian VII. That was the easy part. The hard part was surviving the marriage. Christian VII was young, unstable, and wildly unsuited to the job of king, which would have been fine if he hadn't also been her husband. His mental health issues were publicly apparent and privately terrifying. He oscillated between childishness and cruelty, surrounded himself with flatterers, and frequently disappeared into his own erratic behavior. Caroline Matilda, young and alone in a foreign court, quickly became a royal accessory rather than a partner. At first, she tried to fulfill her role. She bore a son, the future Frederick VI, and attempted to maintain a dignified distance from the king's more disturbing eccentricities. But court life in Copenhagen was a labyrinth of backstabbing courtiers, suspicious advisors, and whispered alliances. It didn't take long before Caroline Matilda found an unlikely lifeline in the form of Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee was a German physician brought in to treat the king. But unlike most royal doctors of the time, whose main talent was bleeding patients and failing upward, Struensee was intelligent, progressive, and strangely charismatic. He gained the king's trust rapidly, becoming not just his doctor, but his de facto advisor. And then he gained something else, the attention of Caroline Matilda. Their relationship, emotional, intellectual, and likely romantic, blossomed in plain sight. Struensee wasn't just helping govern Denmark through royal decree. He was also spending late nights with the Queen, reading, debating, and allegedly doing more than just political strategizing. Whether it was love, escape, or simply the only sane companionship either of them had ever found, the bond between them grew strong and, inevitably, dangerous. Together, Caroline Matilda and Struensee pushed a wave of Enlightenment reforms, abolishing torture, easing censorship, improving sanitation. They were, in effect, trying to drag Denmark into the modern world, which made them enemies of the old one. The Danish aristocracy, already suspicious of a foreign queen and a low-born German doctor, began plotting. By 1772, the backlash exploded. A palace coup removed Struensee from power, arrested him, and charged him with abusing his influence over both king and queen. Caroline Matilda was accused of adultery, stripped of her royal rights, and forcibly separated from her children. Struensee, meanwhile, was executed, the court sending a very clear message about who was allowed to whisper into a monarch's ear. Caroline Matilda was exiled to Schell in northern Germany. She lived there for just a few years, quietly and with a dignity that eluded her earlier life. She died of a sudden illness at the age of 23, still isolated, still under surveillance, still remembered more for the scandal than the courage it took to survive the madness of the Danish court. Her story is often reduced to a romantic tragedy, the lonely queen and her idealistic doctor. But it was also a power play gone wrong. In reaching for a voice, Caroline Matilda challenged more than her marriage. She challenged an entire system designed to silence royal women behind ceremonial obedience. She never returned to Denmark. She never saw her children again. But she remains one of the rare figures in royal history who risked everything, not for power, but for connection. And perhaps that's the real scandal. Not that she loved, but that she dared to do so while wearing a crown. And from one widow cloaked in rumor to another swaddled in black, the next queen built her entire identity on mourning a lost husband. But the whispers followed her anyway, all the way from Buckingham to Balmoral. Because when grief looks too intimate and loyalty too private, even a queen can't escape the rumors of love that dared not speak its name. 13. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria spent over 60 years on the throne, and nearly 40 of them in mourning. She became a national symbol of solemnity, empire, and moral rigidity. But behind the stiff portraits and black crape, there was always one man whose presence, even after death, sparked a scandal that's never been fully resolved. John Brown. Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840. Their marriage, by all accounts, was unusually affectionate for a royal match. They had 9 children, shared political opinions, and even wrote notes to each other during state functions. Which sounds romantic until you remember their shared enthusiasm for micromanaging everyone else's marriages, morals, and wardrobe choices. When Albert died in 1861, Victoria was devastated. Not symbolically, genuinely. She withdrew from public life, wore black for the rest of her reign, and fell into a personal grief that became national performance art. Statues were erected. Rooms were kept exactly as he left them. His memory became her shadow. Enter John Brown. Brown was a Scottish servant who had worked for Albert and later became Victoria's personal attendant. He was gruff, plain-spoken, and had an alarming habit of treating the Queen like a human being. She adored it. He called her woman, a term that would have ended most careers. And she responded not with fury, but familiarity. He had keys to her rooms, influence over her schedule, and a place in her inner life that even her children found suspicious. Soon, the court began whispering. that Brown was too familiar, that he drank too much, that the Queen had lost her mind. Political cartoons mocked him. Prime ministers avoided him. He was accused of using his proximity for influence, though there's little evidence he did anything but irritate the nobility. The rumors escalated until they became their own mythology. Some claimed the two were secretly married. Others speculated that she bore him a child, a claim entirely unsupported by anything except the desperate need to make a sad story salacious. What we know is this. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria was heartbroken. She commissioned yet another statue, kept his belongings close, and requested to be buried with a lock of his hair and a photograph of him in her hand. Her children, of course, removed those items before the burial. The scandal couldn't follow her to the grave, though it lingered above it. Was it a romance? Possibly. Was it companionship in a life defined by ceremonial isolation? Almost certainly. John Brown wasn't a courtier. He didn't flatter her. He didn't politicize her grief. He simply stayed. And in a palace full of people performing affection, that made him unforgettable. Victoria's public image was one of stiff grandeur, the mourning monarch who ruled an empire on the strength of her widowhood. But privately, she may have found a kind of love that existed outside the expectations of her crown. Whether that love was romantic, platonic, or somewhere in between, it was enough to make the most powerful woman in the world human again. And if Victoria ruled through grief, the next queen was remembered for the rumors. Ones that may not have been earned, but once they started, they never stopped. Because once court gossip takes hold, even the most reserved monarchs can't keep their reputations from becoming playgrounds for innuendo. 14. Caroline of Ansbach. Caroline of Ansbach was never meant to be a sensation. She was supposed to be sensible. German, Protestant, diplomatic. The kind of woman who could smooth out the awkward wrinkles in a dynasty built on foreign imports and public mistrust. And for the most part, she did. But even queens who play their parts too well end up sparking rumors, especially when they're the smartest person in the room. Born into a minor German principality in 1683, Caroline was clever from the start. She refused several high-profile marriage offers, including one from the future Holy Roman Emperor, because she insisted on marrying for both duty and compatibility. That was rare. That was risky. That was very Caroline. Eventually, she chose George Augustus, the Elector of Hanover's heir, who would later become George II of Great Britain. It was a political match, but also a personal one, at least at the beginning. Caroline was not only beautiful and well-educated, she also had a knack for pretending to be deferential while secretly running the show. She played chess in the salons and in court politics, and more often than not, she won. When they arrived in England, the couple had already developed their now famous dynamic. George raged, Caroline reasoned. George sulked, Caroline soothed. George ruled publicly, Caroline ruled quietly. She was the brains. He was the formality. But here's where things get complicated. Caroline was fiercely loyal to her husband. There is no strong evidence that she ever took a lover. In fact, she may be one of the few royals in this story who didn't. But what she did do was engage in deep, emotionally intimate relationships with men outside her marriage, not in the shadows, but right under the powdered noses of the court. Her correspondence with various male courtiers, advisors, and clerics was warm, personal, and at times eyebrow-raising for 18th century standards. She enjoyed the company of thinkers, artists, and philosophers. She flirted in her own sharp-tongued way, and she controlled information through networks of male allies who were technically supposed to be loyal to the king. She wasn't promiscuous, but she was powerful, and that was enough to make people whisper. Particularly infamous was her rapport with John Hervey, Lord Hervey, a courtier with a razor-sharp wit and ambiguous romantic inclinations. He was married, possibly bisexual, and undeniably close to the Queen. Their letters crackled with layered jokes, political strategy, and deeply personal disclosures. Was it an affair? Not in the physical sense, but emotional intimacy, especially in public, was dangerous for a queen, and Caroline danced on that edge with deliberate grace. It didn't help that her husband, George II, had his own mistress, Henrietta Howard, a woman Caroline tolerated with the kind of strategic patience that comes from knowing your rival will never be your equal. While George indulged in the typical royal hobby of infidelity, Caroline positioned herself as the moral, intellectual, and political center of the court, making the mistress look like a side character in her own story. She supported religious tolerance. She promoted Enlightenment thinkers. She advised her husband on matters of state, often through subtle psychological maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli. In one particularly revealing incident, she convinced George not to dismiss a beloved minister by pretending to be neutral, while feeding him lines of support during a staged conversation. This was the genius of Caroline. She made power look like affection, and affection look like loyalty. But power, especially female power, always invites suspicion. Some saw her circle of male confidants as improper. Others accused her of manipulating policy through the men around her. And while no scandal was ever confirmed, the rumors were persistent. Not because she was unfaithful, but because she was formidable. She died in 1737 after enduring a long, painful illness. On her deathbed, she reportedly told George to remarry, to which he replied, "No, I shall have mistresses." It was both touching and deeply George, a sentiment that perfectly captured their marriage, functional, complex, and quietly layered with irony. Caroline of Ansbach may not have been promiscuous, but her influence touched every corner of court life. And in a world where women were supposed to be ornamental, her intellect was the greatest scandal of all. But if Caroline's story was about power filtered through propriety, the next queen's legacy is one of quiet contradiction. Publicly pious, privately complex, and frequently overlooked, she left behind a reign filled with loyalty and lingering rumors. Because in a palace full of prayer books and portraits, even the softest sigh becomes something suspicious. 15. Mary II. Mary II is one of the few women in British royal history who ruled not beside a king, but with one. Equally, jointly, legally. But emotionally, that's where the lines begin to blur, and where the rumors begin to rise. Born in 1662 to James, Duke of York, later James II, Mary was a Stuart through and through, raised in royal expectation, baptized into Anglicanism, and married off in what was essentially a Protestant power move. Her husband, William of Orange, her first cousin, and a Dutchman with the personality of a Calvinist thunderstorm. Mary was just 15 when she married him. William was 9 years her senior, serious, politically shrewd, and not particularly interested in romance. The marriage, arranged for diplomatic reasons, was not expected to bloom into some epic love story. But oddly, it did. Eventually. Mary reportedly cried for days after her wedding, horrified by the sudden shift from English comfort to Dutch austerity. But she adapted. She became devoted to William, even as he remained emotionally reserved and often away on military campaigns. She wrote him letters filled with affection, self-doubt, and anxious loyalty. And while she was deeply religious, a quality that shaped both her public image and personal convictions, she was also sensitive, lonely, and keenly aware of how little she controlled. Then came 1688, the Glorious Revolution. Her father, James II, was ousted, and she and William were invited to take the throne. As a daughter, it was betrayal. As a Protestant and a future queen, it was destiny. Together, they ruled as co-monarchs, a constitutional novelty that set an uneasy precedent. William handled most military and foreign policy matters. Mary managed domestic affairs during his absences and was widely praised for her capable governance. But even in shared power, she was scrutinized for her personal life, specifically for how she handled William's. The rumors swirled that William had male favorites, close companions with whom he spent long hours, shared private quarters, and trusted more than anyone else. Most notably, his relationship with Arnold van Keppel, a young Dutch nobleman, raised more than a few aristocratic eyebrows. The king showered him with titles and wealth, and their closeness became court gossip. Whether this was affection, favoritism, or something deeper has never been conclusively determined. But it left Mary in a strange position. She never commented publicly on these relationships. She remained dutiful, dignified, and intensely devoted. But behind her composed facade, her letters betray a woman deeply aware of her isolation. She often turned to religion to cope, seeing herself as a vessel for divine will rather than a participant in personal rebellion. Mary never had children, which added a layer of anxiety to her reign. The lack of an heir was a constant point of pressure, speculation, and disappointment, not just for the public but for her own sense of purpose. In a world where queens were expected to produce heirs above all else, her childlessness was treated like a personal failure, even though the fault may have rested with William. She died young, at just 32, from smallpox. Her death devastated William, who never remarried. And while their relationship remains one of the more curious royal partnerships, it endures as a case study in mutual respect shaped by duty more than desire. Was Mary in love? Possibly. Was she loved back in the same way? Possibly not. But she was loyal to a fault, and that loyalty, in the face of loneliness, political compromise, and personal disappointment, became her legacy. And if Mary II's reign was marked by restraint and silence, the next woman's life was a quiet rebellion against royal expectation. She didn't just survive scandal. She became a walking contradiction, a royal wife who became a royal prisoner, her name forever entangled in the kind of romantic tragedy that no amount of ceremony could sanitize. 16. Sophia Dorothea of Chell. Sophia Dorothea's life reads like a Gothic romance scribbled in the margins of a diplomatic treaty, full of locked rooms, forbidden love, royal hypocrisy, and the lingering echo of a woman's name deliberately forgotten by her own family. She wasn't meant to be a legend. She was meant to be a dynastic placeholder. But when you trap a queen in a cage of duty and then punish her for trying to breathe, the scandal writes itself. Born in 1666, Sophia Dorothea was technically noble, but not quite noble enough for the kind of match that would silence the aristocracy. She was the daughter of George William, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and his longtime mistress, Eleonore Desmier d'Olbreuse. To make their child legitimate, George William did what many reluctant noblemen eventually do. He married the mother. It was a scandal at the time, but not enough to keep Sophia Dorothea out of dynastic circulation. At 16, she was married off to her cousin, George Louis of Hanover, the future King George III of Great Britain. He was sullen, militaristic, and allegedly as affectionate as a stone wall. Their union was purely strategic, and strategically miserable. They had 2 children, George Augustus, later George II, and Sophia Dorothea of Prussia. But whatever domestic tranquility existed in their household was more theatrical than functional. George Louis treated his wife with cold indifference and a faint sense of ownership. He had his own mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg, who was so openly present that the marriage resembled a political hostage situation with a third wheel. Sophia Dorothea, trapped in a loveless, performative court, eventually did what many neglected royals before and after her have done. She sought out someone who actually saw her. That someone was Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, A dashing Swedish soldier of fortune who arrived at court with the perfect resume for romantic disaster. Noble blood, military charm, and a past that suggested a man both dangerous and devoted. Their relationship is still debated by historians. Was it a true love affair, or merely an emotional refuge? There were letters, passionate, breathless, undeniable. The kind of correspondence that makes archivists blush. Whether they ever physically consummated the relationship remains a matter of academic fencing, but to the Hanoverian court, even the idea of it was intolerable. In 1694, their alleged affair was exposed, or more likely, uncovered by political enemies who had been waiting for precisely this kind of opportunity. Königsmark was arrested after sneaking into the palace to meet Sophia Dorothea. He was never seen again. No trial, no confession, just silence. Most historians agree he was murdered, possibly with the complicity of George Louis, and disposed of so discreetly that his fate became part of the myth. As for Sophia Dorothea, she was divorced, not in the romantic, amicable, 21st century sense, but in the full dynastic erasure sense. She was stripped of her titles, forbidden from remarrying, and imprisoned for the rest of her life in the castle of Alden. Her children were taken from her. Her name was removed from official records. She was referred to simply as the Duchess, as though saying her full name might summon some inconvenient memory. She lived in solitary confinement for over 30 years. George Louis, meanwhile, became King of Great Britain in 1714. He never spoke of her again. Their children were raised to consider her a disgrace. Her story became a cautionary tale used to reinforce royal obedience. But over time, the edges of her narrative began to soften. She was no longer just a scandal. She became a symbol. A symbol of what happens when women with no real power dare to reach for something real. Love, autonomy, meaning. Her punishment was not for betrayal, but for refusing to be forgotten. And in the end, they failed. She wasn't forgotten. Not entirely. Today, her legacy flickers in half-told stories and restored letters. A woman sentenced for feeling too much in a system that felt nothing at all. And speaking of women erased for the sake of royal convenience, the next queen's reputation became a patchwork of superstition, dynastic ambition, and shadowy alliances. She was accused not just of manipulation, but of outright sorcery, all while marrying her way straight into the heart of a monarchy barely held together by velvet threads. 17. Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville was never supposed to wear a crown. She was supposed to be the kind of woman history loses between pages. Pretty, well-born, married young, widowed quietly, and politely forgotten. But Elizabeth, widowed with 2 sons, did something outrageous. She married a king, not through political matchmaking or foreign diplomacy, but because he wanted her. And for that, England never forgave her. When she first met Edward IV, she was the daughter of a Lancastrian family, technically on the wrong side of the Wars of the Roses. Her late husband, Sir John Grey, had died fighting against the Yorkists. That made her a political liability, but it also made her desirable. A widow with no fortune but legendary beauty, Elizabeth met the king under uncertain circumstances. Some say she stood beneath a tree, holding her sons, begging for the restoration of her late husband's lands. Others say the meeting was less innocent, more theatrical, more romantic. What's undeniable is that Edward IV married her in secret. A commoner, a political outsider, a woman with no royal blood and no foreign alliance to offer. The court was stunned. His advisers were livid. His cousin, the powerful Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, was so furious he tried to replace Edward entirely. And yet Elizabeth thrived. For a time, she brought her entire family to court, the Woodvilles, and raised them high. Too high, according to many nobles. Her brothers were given titles, her sisters married into power, and her family was seen as grasping, social climbing opportunists. The nobility whispered that Elizabeth was using witchcraft to control the king, that she had enchanted him with spells and charms. One noble accused her of placing her hands on the king in a manner unnatural for a Christian woman, which for 15th century politics was basically code for suspiciously competent. Even her fertility was treated as suspect. She bore Edward 10 children, including the famous princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, who would vanish under the shadow of their uncle, Richard III. Elizabeth's position became increasingly precarious after Edward's sudden death in 1483. As the Queen Dowager, she attempted to secure her eldest son's succession. But Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had other plans. In a coup disguised as guardianship, Richard took control of young Edward V, declared the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth invalid, and locked her 2 sons in the Tower of London, from which they never emerged. That tragedy would haunt Elizabeth's legacy more than any other. She retreated to sanctuary, quite literally, hiding in Westminster Abbey, until political tides shifted again. Eventually, she helped arrange the marriage between her daughter, Elizabeth of York, and Henry Tudor, Henry VII, uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster. That union ended the Wars of the Roses and began the Tudor dynasty. It also made Elizabeth Woodville the grandmother of Henry VIII. And yet, for all her importance, she remains a question mark in royal history. Was she an opportunist, a survivor, a sorceress, a scapegoat? The truth is, she was likely all of these things and none of them. She was a woman navigating the deadliest game in England. Not with armies, but with charm, loyalty, and just enough mystery to stay ahead of the blade. History painted her as a seductress who grasped beyond her station. But in reality, she was a widow who said yes to a king, then spent the rest of her life trying not to be destroyed by that choice. And while Elizabeth Woodville's legacy would be stained by missing sons and a husband's risky romance, the next woman on our list knew all too well what it meant to be a queen in name, but a bystander in court. She outlived her marriage, outlived her station, and somehow, against all odds, may have found freedom in the very rumors meant to destroy her. 18. Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves is often remembered as the wife Henry VIII didn't want, the awkward mismatch in a parade of Tudor catastrophes. But buried beneath that dismissive caricature is a story of accidental survival, courtly reinvention, and a woman who may have won the ultimate Tudor lottery by losing the marriage before it even started. She was the 4th wife in Henry's infamous lineup, the one who came after the beheaded Anne Boleyn and the tragically neglected Jane Seymour. Henry needed a political alliance more than a soulmate, and his advisors, chiefly Thomas Cromwell, arranged a match with Anne, a German noblewoman from the Duchy of Cleves. She arrived in England in 1539, her portraits painted by Hans Holbein the Younger already promising a queen of gentle condition and agreeable beauty. The problem, according to Henry, was that the real Anne didn't match the preview. When he first met her in disguise, as was his favorite ill-advised romantic tactic, he was reportedly unimpressed. She didn't react with the kind of shocked adoration he expected. She simply didn't recognize him. That one awkward encounter soured the entire relationship in his mind before the ink was dry on the marriage contract. To be fair, Anne was no court-trained seductress. She had grown up in a relatively modest, deeply Protestant household with little exposure to the art of royal flattery. She couldn't dance, she spoke limited English, and she had no interest in pretending to adore a king nearly twice her age, with a festering leg and a volatile temper. She did what many women might do in her situation. She smiled, nodded, and tried not to cause a diplomatic incident. But Henry had already decided she was a disappointment. He famously referred to her as a Flanders mare, a term often misquoted but representative of the general disdain he felt for her. Their marriage was never consummated and barely tolerated. Within 6 months, Henry had it annulled, citing non-consummation and her pre-contract to another nobleman. That could have been the end for Anne, a humiliating exit, followed by exile or worse. But instead, she negotiated what might be the most graceful defeat in royal history. Anne accepted the annulment with pragmatic elegance. She expressed no public bitterness, agreed to the king's terms, and was rewarded with a generous settlement, several estates, a lifelong income, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. She was invited to court events, given precedence over all women except the queen and the king's daughters, and lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life. Far from a disgraced ex-wife, she became something stranger, a kind of royal in-law who no longer had to perform the exhausting duties of a queen, but still enjoyed many of the perks. She attended coronations, dined with her former husband, and kept cordial relations with the Tudor children, particularly Mary and Elizabeth. She was never suspected of political intrigue, never accused of scandal, and never remarried, a fact that historians debate. Was it personal choice, quiet trauma, or simply recognition that she had escaped something that most of Henry's wives could not? Because here's the twist. Of all of Henry's 6 wives, Anne of Cleves was one of only 2 who outlived him. The other, Catherine Parr, endured her own series of court dramas. Anne, meanwhile, watched from a distance, wealthy, safe, and unbothered. And though there's no firm evidence of romantic liaisons after her annulment, rumors inevitably swirled. She was young, free, and surrounded by courtiers. Some whispered that she had secret lovers. Others suggested she remained celibate, loyal in name if not in law. But the most compelling part of Anne's legacy is not what she might have done behind closed doors. It's how she navigated the treacherous waters of Tudor politics without sinking. Anne of Cleves wasn't the queen Henry wanted, but she may have been the only one who figured out how to turn rejection into liberation. And while Anne escaped Henry's orbit with her head intact and bank account flourishing, the next queen was not so lucky. She played the game with dignity, endured humiliation with grace, and clung to her royal title even as her world crumbled. Because in Tudor England, being right rarely mattered when you were married to the wrong king. 19. Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the queen who wouldn't go quietly. She was Henry VIII's first wife, the daughter of Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, and arguably the only woman in his life he genuinely feared. She wasn't just regal, she was relentless. And when the court turned against her, she didn't bend. She planted herself like a stone and refused to be moved. Catherine married Arthur, Prince of Wales, when she was just 16. Arthur died within months, leaving her a widow in a foreign land with an uncertain future. Years later, she married Arthur's younger brother, Henry, a union approved by a special papal dispensation, since church law typically frowned upon marrying your deceased husband's sibling. But Henry was young, charismatic, and eager to claim his bride. For over 20 years, Catherine was Queen of England, not just in title, but in presence. She was admired for her piety, intelligence, and diplomatic grace. She bore Henry several children, but only one, Mary, survived infancy. And with each failed pregnancy, the pressure mounted. Henry began to see his lack of a male heir not as fate, but as divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. Enter Anne Boleyn. Henry's growing obsession with Anne, combined with his increasing paranoia about his legacy, led to what would become known as the King's Great Matter, his push to annul his marriage to Catherine. But Catherine refused. She claimed, with passionate conviction, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. In the eyes of God, she insisted, she was Henry's lawful wife, and no man, not even a king, could undo that. The battle raged for years. Henry appealed to Rome. Catherine appealed to public sympathy. She became a figure of defiance, representing tradition, faith, and queenly dignity in the face of political betrayal. Even as Anne Boleyn rose at court, Catherine remained in England, refusing to acknowledge the annulment, the new queen, or the new religious order that Henry used to justify it all. She was eventually banished from court, separated from her daughter, and confined to increasingly remote residences. But she never stopped calling herself queen. Not princess, not dowager, queen. Henry remarried. Parliament declared the marriage void. The Church of England broke from Rome. And through it all, Catherine endured, quietly, fiercely, without surrender. Even in exile, she was surrounded by loyal attendants, many of whom risked their own positions to stay with her. Rumors, of course, found their way into the margins. Some claimed she had once loved a nobleman before marrying Arthur. Others suggested secret attachments during her long exile. But none of these stories stuck. Catherine's legend was forged not in scandal, but in resistance. She became the patron saint of rejected wives, the woman who lost everything but refused to lose herself. She died in 1536, still insisting on her title, still longing to see her daughter, still wearing the crown in her mind, if not on her head. Henry sent no final message. He had already moved on, or tried to, but the shadow of Catherine never truly left him. She remained, even in death, a quiet rebuke to his vanity, his volatility, and his endless quest for the perfect queen. And if Catherine's tragedy was born from steadfastness, the next royal endured her own kind of royal spiral, caught between politics, passion, and the high-stakes chessboard of Scottish diplomacy. Her story is less about virtue and more about survival. And in the world of crowns and courtrooms, those two things rarely align. 20. Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor was born into royalty and married into chaos. As the elder sister of Henry VIII and daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, she was bred for diplomacy, designed to unite crowns and end wars. Instead, her life was defined by rebellion, betrayal, and the kind of romantic entanglements that would make a Tudor family reunion feel like a courtroom drama with side dishes of passive aggression. Her first marriage was a blockbuster political deal. In 1503, at the age of 13, she was sent north to marry James IV of Scotland, as part of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace between England and Scotland. The peace, of course, lasted exactly 10 years, which in Tudor terms might as well count as a golden age. Despite the tension between their countries, Margaret's marriage to James IV was reportedly affectionate. She bore him 6 children, though only one, James V, survived infancy. But just when it looked like she might have secured a stable royal life, war broke out between England and Scotland. Her brother, Henry VIII, invaded France in 1513, and James IV, honoring his alliance with France, retaliated by invading England. He died at the Battle of Flodden, leaving Margaret a widow at the age of 23. That's when things started to unravel, not suddenly, but with the slow elegance of a royal carriage sliding off a cliff. As the mother of the infant heir, James V, Margaret was named Regent of Scotland, but there was one condition: she had to remain unmarried, which she didn't. Within a year, she secretly wed Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus, a decision that made her enemies at court multiply like courtiers at a coronation feast. Angus was ambitious, unfaithful, and deeply unpopular with the Scottish nobility. Their marriage quickly devolved into a cold war of political maneuvering and personal betrayal. Margaret's position as regent was revoked, and she fled to England in 1516, seeking refuge from her own husband and the court that had once accepted her. While in England, she attempted to get an annulment. Her brother Henry VIII, always one to give marital advice he refused to follow, supported her, but the Pope did not. She eventually returned to Scotland and entered a period of political limbo, no longer regent, not quite a queen dowager, and still technically married to a man who no longer lived with her, but certainly used her name for his own benefit. Eventually, she managed to separate from Angus and secure a legal annulment. No small feat in a world where royal marriages were tools of diplomacy, and women were rarely granted the dignity of autonomy. But Margaret, much like her brother, refused to be told no by anyone short of God. And even then, only if he was wearing a crown. Her third marriage, to Henry Stuart, later Lord Methven, was less politically dangerous but just as disappointing. He turned out to be yet another unfaithful courtier with more ambition than tact. Margaret's personal life became a long, exhausting series of public humiliations and private negotiations, not for love, but for survival. Through all this, she continued to play a role in Scottish politics, often acting as a go-between for her son James V and the English court. She was constantly balancing loyalty to her son, her birth country, and her own precarious dignity. Her letters to Henry VIII are filled with pleading, strategy, and the kind of familial exhaustion only Tudor siblings could inspire. Margaret's life wasn't defined by a single affair, or even a scandal in the traditional sense. Instead, her romantic history was one of accumulation, of mistakes made under pressure, of marriages that served politics more than affection, of love repaid with infidelity and suspicion. There are whispers, of course, of flirtations and alliances that might have been more than diplomatic. Margaret was attractive, intelligent, and frequently alone in courts filled with opportunists. Some letters suggest deeper emotional ties with certain courtiers, but nothing was ever confirmed, and history, especially Tudor history, is reluctant to separate female ambition from moral suspicion. In the end, Margaret Tudor died quietly in 1541, largely sidelined by the very dynasties she helped unite. But her legacy endured. Her great-grandson would be James VI of Scotland and I of England, the first monarch to rule both kingdoms, the very thing her marriage was meant to secure. Margaret's scandal wasn't one of seduction or betrayal. It was the scandal of trying to survive, as a woman, as a widow, as a queen, in a world that punished every choice she made, even the correct ones. And if Margaret's life was a long negotiation with fate, the next queen entered history's stage already branded with suspicion. She ruled with fire and faith, but was never free from the rumors that swirled around her court and her bed. Because in a realm torn between heaven and heresy, even the Virgin Mary wasn't above reproach. 21. Mary I of England. Mary I, often remembered as Bloody Mary, inherited a throne soaked in political betrayal and familial sabotage. She was England's first queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, not as a wife or mother, but as a sovereign, and the country never let her forget how uncomfortable that made them. Born to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary's early years were steeped in privilege and papal approval. But when her father annulled his marriage to her mother, everything changed. She was declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, and reduced from princess to lady with all the grace of a royal slap. Her identity and her legitimacy were political footballs for much of her adolescence. She eventually reclaimed her place in the line of succession after years of uncertainty and humiliation. And when her brother, Edward VI, died without issue, Mary seized the throne with the determination of someone who had been told for 2 decades that she didn't belong. Her reign began with hope and ended in embers. Her decision to marry Philip II of Spain was meant to secure a Catholic alliance and stabilize her realm. Instead, it ignited xenophobia, court unrest, and widespread fear that England would become a vassal state to a foreign Catholic power. Their marriage was, to put it kindly, underwhelming. Philip spent more time abroad than with Mary, and while she adored him, he treated the union like a strategic layover. She experienced at least 2 phantom pregnancies, moments where she believed she was carrying an heir, only to be met with nothing but silence and embarrassment. The court whispered. The public speculated. The pressure to produce an heir, particularly a Catholic one, became unbearable. And in that pressure cooker, the rumors flourished, that Mary had secret lovers, that the pregnancies were a cover for an affair, that her devotion to Philip masked deeper, more human desires. None of it was proven. All of it was believed. Mary was deeply religious, more so than political, and she genuinely saw her reign as a divine mission to return England to Catholicism. Her persecution of Protestants, the burnings that earned her the infamous nickname, wasn't born from sadism, but from a grim sense of duty. She believed she was saving souls, even as bodies burned. But belief is rarely a good alibi, and history was not kind. As for her private life, Mary left little evidence of any romantic attachments beyond Philip. She was, by all accounts, devoted to him in a way that feels tragic in retrospect. He was cold, distant, and strategic. She was loyal to a fault. Their relationship was more business merger than courtly romance, and once the alliance had served its purpose, Philip drifted back to Spain, leaving Mary with a nation in turmoil and no heir to secure her vision of England. She died in 1558, exhausted, childless, and convinced she had failed. Her legacy would be immediately buried under her sister Elizabeth's glittering reign, her memory reduced to blood, failure, and a cautionary tale about mixing religion with rule. But behind the caricature was a woman shaped by abandonment, driven by faith, and haunted by a marriage that never delivered what it promised. Mary's scandal wasn't adultery, it was devotion. To a country that mistrusted her, a husband who ignored her, and a religion that demanded sacrifice at all costs. And in that quiet, dignified suffering, the court found a scandal far more unnerving than lust: sincerity. And from the haunted rooms of Mary's palace, we now move into deeper shadows, where daughters, nieces, and illegitimate royals lived out their own scandals in the blind spots of history, their names forgotten, but their reputations forever smudged with rumor. 22. Isabella of England and the Illegitimate Daughters. There is a particular kind of invisibility that attaches itself to the women in history who were never meant to be remembered. Daughters born on the wrong side of the bed, nieces married off for treaties, royal women whose names were recorded not in chronicles, but in receipts, dowries, trousseaux, the occasional scandal hushed up with a well-placed title or a strategic exile. And then there are women like Isabella of England, legitimate enough to matter, but never quite enough to be safe from being erased. Isabella, born in 1214, was the 4th child and 2nd daughter of King John of England and Isabella of Angoulême. That made her the sister of Henry III, and thus a key piece in the ever-shifting chessboard of Plantagenet politics. Like most royal daughters of the period, her life wasn't about personal choice. It was about placement, leverage, who she could marry, and what England might gain from it. She was married off at the age of 21 to Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. Not a bad match on paper. Frederick was one of the most powerful men in Europe, known as Stupor Mundi, or the wonder of the world. Charismatic, cultured, multilingual, and famously ruthless. He was a monarch who inspired as much awe as fear. But while historians often fawn over Frederick's intellect and style, his marriages were more strategic than sentimental. And Isabella? She was one more strategic acquisition. Their marriage was conducted largely in absentia. After her departure from England, Isabella spent much of her time in Sicily, isolated from the imperial court. Frederick had other priorities, including several concubines, a string of mistresses, and an ongoing battle with the Pope. Isabella bore him children, including Henry, who briefly held the title King of the Romans. But little else is known of her inner life. What is known is this: she died young, at the age of 27, far from home, and largely forgotten by the court that had once celebrated her as a diplomatic prize. There's no confirmed record of Isabella's own affairs or lovers, not in the traditional documented sense. But the absence of scandal in the official record often tells its own story. Isabella lived in a world where royal women were expected to endure neglect quietly, while kings collected mistresses like coats. Her letters, if they exist, haven't survived. Her voice was never committed to the public record. What remains is a faint outline, the silhouette of a queen consort who gave the empire an air and then vanished into the shadows of male ambition. But while Isabella herself left little in the way of scandal, the idea of royal women's sexuality, particularly those born illegitimately or outside the central dynastic spotlight, was often weaponized. The Plantagenets, Tudors, and Stuarts were notorious for leaving trails of unofficial daughters in their wake. These women, born without the sanctifying glare of the crown, were both liabilities and assets. They could be married off quietly, elevated when politically convenient, or blamed when something needed explaining. Take, for instance, the many illegitimate daughters of Charles II, a king whose court treated monogamy like a seasonal affectation. His daughters by mistresses such as Barbara Villiers and Louise de Querouaille were brought to court, married to dukes, and paraded as near royalty. But they also lived under the burden of whispered suspicion. Every move they made, every close friendship, every foreign visitor, became fodder for gossip. Similarly, the illegitimate children of Henry I, a staggering 20 to 25 of them, included several daughters who were married into noble families across England and Normandy. While few of their personal stories survive in detail, the implications of their lives are clear. Royal blood gave them visibility. Illegitimacy gave them vulnerability. Their marriages were arranged. Their reputations were disposable. For many of these women, the line between companionship and compromise was thin. They were often matched with older men, foreign nobles, or questionable allies. If they resisted, they were defiant. If they complied, they were rumored to be opportunists. And if they fell in love on their own terms, or worse, were suspected of doing so, the consequences were swift. Isolation, loss of title, quiet exile. Even the suggestion of impropriety was enough to render a royal woman untouchable. The scandal wasn't always about who they loved. Sometimes it was simply that they loved at all. Isabella of England. And the constellation of royal and semi-royal daughters like her occupies a strange space in the historical narrative. They are not remembered for their voices, but for their uses. When they appear in chronicles, it's often as marginalia, married off, died in childbirth, retired to a convent. But the silence around their private lives is louder than any scandal. Because in royal courts, especially in the pre-modern world, a woman's greatest sin was not having lovers. It was having agency over who those lovers were. And that brings us to one such royal woman. One who lived abroad but whose bloodline and choices kept her forever tied to England's dynastic myth. A queen who loved poetry, made enemies out of empires, and whose romantic liaisons were rumored to be as politically calculated as they were passionately personal. 23. Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia. Elizabeth Stuart, born in 1596, was the daughter of James VI of Scotland and I of England. a king obsessed with order, theology, and his own image. She was raised in a court where appearances mattered more than affections, and where daughters were educated not to lead, but to allure. But Elizabeth had other ideas. From the start, she was seen as something exceptional. Intelligent, witty, and striking, she was known as the Winter Queen, a nickname that came later, with a legacy soaked in tragedy and grandeur. But before the frost, there was fire. In 1613, at the age of 16, Elizabeth married Frederick V, Elector Palatine, a Protestant German prince. It was a love match, but also a political gamble. The marriage was meant to strengthen Protestant alliances against the growing power of Catholic Europe, particularly the Habsburgs. For a time, it worked. Elizabeth and Frederick became the glamorous young couple of the Protestant world, modern, passionate, idealistic. And then they lost everything. In 1619, Frederick accepted the crown of Bohemia, offered to him by Protestant rebels during the early stages of the 30 Years' War. Elizabeth became queen, briefly. Their reign lasted only a single winter before they were driven out by Habsburg forces at the Battle of White Mountain. Hence, the Winter Queen. It was the beginning of decades in exile. Elizabeth and Frederick fled to The Hague, where they lived a strange parallel life, technically royal, practically impoverished. Frederick died in 1632, leaving Elizabeth a widow at 36, with a dozen children, little money, and even less power. And it's here, in exile, that the rumors about Elizabeth's romantic life begin to take on a life of their own. Surrounded by poets, philosophers, courtiers, and foreign diplomats, Elizabeth maintained an unusually open court for a woman in her position. She corresponded with intellectuals. She patronized artists. She cultivated alliances. And yes, she allegedly formed close relationships with certain men, some of whom were young, ambitious, and not at all shy about being seen in her company. One name that surfaces often is William Craven, an English nobleman and military man who supported Elizabeth financially and politically during her long widowhood. Their relationship was long-lasting, deeply affectionate, and the subject of much speculation. While there is no definitive proof that they were lovers, contemporaries certainly believe so, and perhaps more importantly, they wanted to believe so, because nothing thrills a court, even one in exile, like the idea of a queen in mourning being comforted in private. Other rumors swirled around visiting courtiers, ambassadors, and poets. Elizabeth's wit, charm, and refusal to be erased made her a magnet for gossip. And while she denied nothing and confirmed less, the idea of the Winter Queen melting for someone other than her lost husband became a kind of romantic footnote to her long exile. But here's the twist. The real scandal wasn't whether she had lovers. It was that she survived without needing a crown or a king. She raised her children, brokered alliances, and maintained a level of political influence despite being a queen without a kingdom. Her son Charles Louis would eventually reclaim the Palatinate. Her daughter Sophia would become Electress of Hanover and the mother of King George III of Great Britain, tying Elizabeth back into the British monarchy she'd once been exiled from. Elizabeth Stuart died in 1662, still in The Hague, still technically dispossessed, but surrounded by the legacy she had carved out of ruins. Her reputation, like her romantic life, remains a blend of speculation and admiration. A queen who lost everything and yet managed to keep herself. And if Elizabeth's exile made her dangerous in the imagination of courts, the next queen arrived from Portugal with a different kind of peril, one that came not from whispers of lovers, but from the silence of a marriage that was never really allowed to begin. A queen consort who stayed faithful to a king who never bothered to pretend. 24. Catherine of Braganza. Catherine of Braganza arrived in England in 1662, a Portuguese princess armed with a dowry fit to impress even the most bankrupt of monarchs, which conveniently was exactly what Charles II happened to be. Her marriage to him was not born of affection or politics alone, but of a post-war agreement, part economic, part strategic, and entirely transactional. What she didn't know, or perhaps chose not to believe, was that her husband had already filled the royal household with so many mistresses that there were barely any rooms left for a queen. She was 23, devoutly Catholic, and raised in a cloistered Iberian court defined by ritual, religious devotion, and family loyalty. England, by contrast, had just restored its monarchy after years of Puritan rule, and Charles II, the so-called merry monarch, was throwing a decade-long party to make up for lost time. Catherine, to put it delicately, did not fit the mood. From the moment she stepped off the ship, she became an object of both curiosity and discomfort. Her Catholicism made her instantly unpopular with the Protestant establishment, and her quiet demeanor was frequently interpreted as coldness. She didn't dance well, didn't drink excessively, didn't enjoy scandal, and was disinclined to indulge the roguish winks of courtiers whose entire careers were built on innuendo. Charles was gracious at first, or at least diplomatic. He welcomed her, married her, and even tolerated her Portuguese retinue for a time. But the truth was, his heart, or whatever piece of him passed for a heart, already belonged elsewhere. Several elsewheres, in fact, chief among them, Barbara Palmer, Lady Castlemaine, his long-standing mistress who remained lodged in court like an immovable stain. Catherine was forced not only to accept Barbara's presence but to acknowledge her publicly. It was humiliation by etiquette, and yet she endured. What makes Catherine of Braganza so fascinating isn't the rumor of affairs, it's the lack of them. In a court drowning in excess and titillated by every whispered tryst, Catherine remained famously faithful. She produced no children, which was both a personal tragedy and a national scandal. Her failure to bear an heir opened the floodgates for speculation. Was it her fault? Was it divine punishment? Was Charles simply uninterested? There's no conclusive answer. We know she suffered multiple miscarriages and periods of ill health, but beyond that, the record remains maddeningly silent. What did echo through the corridors of Whitehall, however, were the ever-present whispers about what she might have done, or should have done, to reclaim her power. Some claimed she was secretly seeing her chaplains. Others suggested flirtations with Portuguese attendants, or that she may have had an emotional entanglement with a foreign ambassador. These claims were never proven and were likely fabricated by those looking to destabilize her already fragile position. In 1678, during the hysteria of the Popish plot, a fabricated Catholic conspiracy to assassinate the king, Catherine herself was accused of complicity. It was absurd, but it stuck long enough to require a formal inquiry. She was, for a brief and ridiculous moment, the almost queen regicide. Through it all, she maintained her composure. She never denounced Charles, never spoke out against his mistresses, and never left England, though she might have had cause to. Her pride was wounded, but never surrendered. She created her own courtly bubble, populated by musicians, artists, and fellow exiles. She introduced tea to England, which may seem like a footnote. But in cultural terms, it was one of the most enduring legacies of any royal consort. Catherine and Charles, oddly enough, seemed to settle into a mutual rhythm by the end. He never loved her in the way a husband is supposed to love a wife, but he defended her when it mattered. When pressured to divorce her after years of childlessness, he refused, saying, "She is a good woman, and I will not part with her for all the women in the world." Was it affection? Guilt? Habit? Probably all three. But for Catherine, that was enough. After Charles's death in 1685, she stayed in England for a time before returning to Portugal, where she lived as a dowager queen, quietly managing her estates and finally finding the peace that had eluded her in England. She never remarried, never engaged in public scandal, and never published memoirs or complaints, even though she would have been well within her rights. The rumors about her lovers remain just that, rumors, but what they reveal is more telling than the facts. The court couldn't handle the idea of a queen so restrained, so dignified, so unwilling to play the game. They had to invent passion, assign lovers, fabricate desire, because they couldn't accept the scandal of a woman who refused to become a scandal. Catherine of Braganza was not the queen the Restoration wanted, but she was, in many ways, the queen it needed, a reminder that loyalty, even in the face of humiliation, can be its own quiet form of rebellion. And while Catherine's restraint was a scandal in its own right, the final queen in our list embraced controversy by simply being too French, too Catholic, and too fond of her inner circle. Her very presence at court was enough to make Parliament uneasy and gossip columnists euphoric. She was a royal consort by name, but a conspirator, mystic, and rumored seductress by reputation. 25. Henrietta Maria. Henrietta Maria of France was born to a world of incense, processions, and diplomatic theater. As the daughter of King Henry IV of France and Marie de Medici, she carried with her the combined bloodlines of two dynasties famous for loving power almost as much as they loved spectacle. When she married Charles I of England in 1625, it was less a romantic union than a nervous handshake between two anxious kingdoms, Protestant England and Catholic France, trying to pretend they liked each other. She was 15. He was 24. She didn't speak English, and he didn't speak much French. She brought with her a retinue of French courtiers, chaplains, and musicians, all of whom promptly insulted, offended, or confused the English public. Her Catholic faith alone was enough to create unrest, but it was her personality that truly fanned the flames. Henrietta Maria was not shy. She was witty, assertive, emotionally expressive, and entirely uninterested in toning down her Frenchness to appease her new subjects. Early on, her relationship with Charles was rocky. He insisted on dismissing her French attendants. She resisted. He pouted. She sulked. But eventually the two found common ground. Unlike many other royal couples, their marriage developed into a genuine love match. And yet, love was no protection against scandal. Henrietta Maria's deep friendships with male courtiers, particularly artists and musicians, drew speculation. Her fondness for George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, a favorite of Charles and frequent subject of court gossip, raised eyebrows. While Buckingham was closer to the king than the queen, rumors of a strange triangulation of intimacy spread like spilled wine across a court table. Later, her affection for Henry Germain, her master of the horse, would ignite further speculation. Germain was always near her, managing her estates, guarding her secrets, and appearing in just enough compromising context to make the gossip inevitable. Some said he was her lover. Others whispered that he fathered one of her children, a claim historians largely reject, but one that stuck because it was more interesting than the truth. In a court racked with religious tension and political anxiety, a foreign queen showing too much independence was scandal enough. Add a few loyal favorites and some whispered confessions, and you had the perfect cocktail for court paranoia. Henrietta Maria didn't help herself by refusing to play the silent consort. She openly advocated for Catholicism, hosted foreign diplomats, and involved herself in state matters. During the English Civil War, she wasn't just the king's wife. She was his co-conspirator. She raised funds for the royalist cause, negotiated arms deals, and delivered rousing speeches. Her loyalty to Charles was total, and that loyalty made her dangerous. When the monarchy fell, she fled to France. Charles was executed in 1649, and Henrietta Maria became the widow of a failed king, a queen in name but not in power. She lived in exile for years, attempting to restore her son Charles II to the throne. And eventually she succeeded. After the restoration, she returned to England briefly, older and less flamboyant, but no less scrutinized. Even in her later years, the rumors didn't stop. Her salons in Paris were filled with philosophers, poets, and exiled English nobles. Her inner circle remained tight, theatrical, and just suggestive enough to keep the pamphlets printing. Henrietta Maria died in France in 1669, having outlived her husband, her enemies, and most of the kingdom that once loathed her. History remembers her as a meddler, a foreigner, and a queen who interfered. But she was also a survivor, a strategist, and, in her own way, a romantic. Someone who believed in love, loyalty, and the divine right of kings, even when it cost her everything. And as for the lovers, maybe they existed, maybe they didn't. But in a court where power was measured in whispers and proximity, the appearance of intimacy was often more influential than the act itself. In the end, Henrietta Maria, like so many of the women on this list, was guilty not of scandal, but of being seen. And for a queen, that was always the most unforgivable sin.